case I want to look at with you guys that starts to establish exactly where this search line happens, where this expectation, this reasonable expectation of privacy is delineated, is a case from 1997 called the Crown versus Stillman. This is a case that went to the Supreme Court of Canada. On the way there, you had judges deciding different ways on the way up. When it got to the Supreme Court of Canada, you had different judges of the Supreme Court deciding one way, different judges deciding the other. Just to give you an idea, this whole topic can be very controversial. You have the very highest judges in the country disagreeing over what the appropriate result is. So here's the story. There was a 17-year-old who was arrested in connection with a sexual assault where the girl was found dead. This girl had been raped and murdered. She had bite marks on her abdomen. And so because of the bite marks, because of the nature of this whole thing, the police were very, very motivated to try and get evidence from it. And they definitely wanted to get a bite sample from any suspect they might have. So they had this suspect, William Wayne Dale Stillman, in custody. And he contacted his lawyer because he had the right to speak to a lawyer. And the lawyers had made it absolutely clear, do not give them any samples of anything, no matter what. And so he made it clear to the police that he did not consent to any DNA samples of any kind. So the police held on to him for a while, but they absolutely did not want a potential suspect guilty of this horrendous crime to get loose. So they decided that regardless of the lack of consent, regardless of the fact that they didn't obtain a warrant because they hadn't convinced any judge yet that there was a good enough reason to get samples from this kid, they swabbed his mouth. That means they put material in his mouth to collect DNA cells from the lining of his mouth, and they had him yank hair out of very sensitive areas of his body in order to provide samples. So they got this from without his consent. They also forced him to make a teeth impression, so they would have like an example of what is the imprint that his teeth would make if he were to bite something. So all this is very forcible, very intrusive. Like they're picking him up and holding his jaw open and doing all this stuff, even though he's clearly not consented to doing it. After that, they then interrogated him, and in the course of this interrogation, they managed to get this 17-year-old to the brink of tears. He was crying all over the place. So they escorted him to the police washroom in the police station. He blew his nose, and he threw a Kleenex in the waste paper basket in the police station toilet. Like not in the toilet itself, but in the bathroom there. And so the police officer who escorted him, after he didn't close the door, he just had him blow his nose, and then we saw that the kid threw the Kleenex in the wastebasket, decided, yoink, I'm going to take this because we got some DNA on this right here. So what happened was, when it went to the Supreme Court, ultimately the Supreme Court decided that he had a reasonable expectation of privacy in all these things. However, even though he had a reasonable expectation of privacy in the Kleenex that he had thrown out, they still allowed the Kleenex as evidence because they said he threw it in plain sight of the police officer. Even though it breached Section 8, it didn't do so in such a severe way as to make it unfair that they would be able to take it. So it was considered to be breaching Section 8, but again, the Charter allows you to breach things a little bit. They allowed it in as evidence. The other stuff, though, the swabs from his mouth, the samples of his hair, the bite impression from his teeth, that was not allowed as evidence. So some of this stuff falls within the reasonable expectation of privacy. Some of it does not. But in this case, all of it did, but some of it was too minor of a breach of his expectation of privacy for it to be limited. So you can see it's a very messy line that has to be crossed here. What they were doing in that case in Stillman was applying these criteria that they gotten from a little earlier case called Edwards. And we're going to look at Edwards because this is the source of really where this test comes from. And in Edwards, the Supreme Court in Edwards set out a bunch of factors that you have to consider all at the same time in order to decide whether the reasonable expectation of privacy exists. They said, okay, among the things you have to consider, and they said this isn't an exhaustive list, but it's an important list. They said whether or not the person whose expectation of privacy it is present at the time of the search. If you're present, then it means that you have a higher expectation of privacy in whatever it is that's going through, right? If it's something that you keep near you at all times, then you have a right to expect that it won't be violated right in front of you. So keep in mind, that means that if it's a bag that you leave behind somewhere, then you don't have as high of an expectation of privacy in it as if it's on your person. Possession or control of what's searched. This can be like if it's actually in your hands. If you've got a backpack on your back, you have a higher expectation of privacy than if you leave your backpack in the trunk of somebody else's car. Ownership of the place, like if it's your house, then you have a higher expectation of privacy than if it's a hotel room that you're renting. If it's your car and you own the car, you have a higher expectation of privacy than if it's a rental car. It might seem like a strange distinction here, but the Supreme Court says this is important. Ability to regulate access to the place. Really, this means, can you put a lock on it? If you can put a lock on it and it's locked, that increases your expectation of privacy. It increases your belief that people are probably not going to be able to get at your stuff. But if you can't actually even lock the place or stop people from going in there, then you wouldn't have as high of an expectation that people wouldn't mess around. Think of, for example, let's say you have a shed on your property, right? If there's no lock on the shed, then you might expect, oh, somebody might wander onto my property, even without my permission, and be able to see in there what I have going on. But if you really have a strong lock and a padlock on it, then that's going to increase your expectation that people aren't normally going to see it. And because it increases your expectation that regular people aren't normally going to see it, then it increases your right to assert that the police aren't allowed to look at it without your consent or without a warrant. There's also this idea of your own subjective expectation of privacy. If you really believe this isn't something that people would have the right to look through, that actually increases your legal right for this to be something that people aren't allowed to look through. That's strange, but I'm going to say it again. If you believe that the police aren't allowed to look at something, that actually increases your legal right to not have the police look at something. Now, that may seem strange, so the Supreme Court adds on this objective element, that it's not just your subjective expectation, but if your expectation is reasonable, objectively speaking, like if a regular person would look at it and be like, yeah, it's fair for him to think that the police wouldn't be able to see that thing, that's also going to increase your privacy. So these 6 factors are going to be very, very important in the assignment you guys will have coming up that I'll explain to you in a later class. I want you to be able to come back to this video and refer to it. These 6 factors, being present at the time of the search, this increases your expectation of privacy. Possession or control increases it. Ownership of the place increases it. Your ability to put a lock on the thing increases your expectation of privacy. Your belief that it's private increases your expectation of privacy. And how reasonable that belief is increases your expectation of privacy. Now, all this I mentioned comes from the case of Edwards in 1996. This was a story where there was a drug dealer who, in order to not be arrested with drugs on his person, he decided to keep the drugs in his girlfriend's apartment. Now, what happened was the police got the idea from watching this guy. They realized that he was stowing his drugs in her place. So they went to her apartment, and at her door, they lied to her and essentially set it up so that they got a consent search out of her without her realizing that she had a right to say no, without her realizing she didn't have to let the police into the apartment. And so they got in. They found this guy's drugs, the boyfriend's drugs. And the girlfriend even said when they found the drugs in her place, she said, yeah, those belong to my boyfriend, Mr. Edwards. Now, when he was arrested, he denied that the drugs were his. And the question in this case, because it's all about the search, a search only exists if there's a reasonable expectation of privacy. So then the question became, was there a reasonable expectation of privacy here? And remember, this is the case where they introduced those 6 factors, being present, possession or control, ownership of the place, ability to regulate access, subjective belief, objective reasonability of that belief. And they decided in this case that there was no expectation of privacy. Because Section 8 protects people, not places. That's why you being present at the time is significant. Now, the woman may have had a reasonable expectation of privacy in her apartment, but that doesn't mean the apartment itself has privacy, right? The privacy relates to the person who's being accused, and he did not have an expectation of privacy in her apartment. He didn't have a lock on the door there, right? He didn't own the place. He wasn't present at the time of the search. He couldn't control whether or not people went in there. That was all up to her. And this is really strange to me, but the Supreme Court even said, because he denied ownership of the drugs in this case, which makes sense because he's being charged with essentially crimes relating to owning these drugs, he didn't want to be found guilty, so he said, no, they're not mine. Because he denied ownership of the drugs, he can't assert privacy over them. And what ends up happening is he's convicted based on the fact that they did find this evidence and the determination that these drugs did belong to him. So you might see a bit of a paradox here. It might seem really crazy, but ultimately the important thing to retain is when they applied these 6 factors in the case of Edwards, they applied them and found that he did not have a reasonable expectation of privacy.